Hello, Year 2, how are you? And welcome to today's history lesson. So in our last history lesson, we started learning about Florence Nightingale. And by the end of the lesson, you should have been able to answer the questions. Who was Florence Nightingale? Was she rich or poor? What was her job? Where was she born? And when was she alive? Okay, now today we're going to be looking at the question, why did Florence Nightingale travel to Scutari, which is in Turkey? We're going to be looking at some different sources. Can you remember what a source is? Yes, that's right, brilliant. A source is a piece of evidence. So we're going to be comparing some different sources. And because we're learning more about Florence Nightingale, you'll be able to tell me more about what made her famous. And you'll also be able to add some events to your timeline that you created last lesson. Now, before we look at today's question, we're going to see how much you can remember from last lesson. So here is your retrieval quiz for today. Now you need to answer true or false. So there are some sentences and you need to decide if they are true or false. And if they're false, you need to correct them for me. So let's read through the sentences together. The first one, her family were Italian. She was born in Italy. She was from a poor family. Her family were happy that she wanted to become a nurse. She was alive during the reign of Queen Victoria. And she trained to become a nurse in London. Okay, so you need to decide if they're true or false, and if they're false, correct them for me. Okay, pause the video now and have a go. Okay, Year 2, let's see how much you remembered from last lesson. So the first one, her family were Italian. Now, were her family Italian? No, they weren't. They were British, so that one's false. The next one, she was born in Italy. Was she born in Italy? Yes, she was. Well done. Can you remember the city in Italy that she was born in? Yes, that's right. She was born in Florence, and that's how she got her name. And do you remember when we looked at the map? Italy was the country that looked like a boot, that was in the shape of a boot. Now, the next one. She was from a poor family. Was Florence Nightingale poor, or was she rich? That's right. That's false. She was from a very wealthy family. Remember, wealthy is a synonym for rich. We learned the word wealthy last lesson. So she was from a very wealthy family. And remember, they lived on that big estate called Emily Park, that big house with lots of servants. And that house today is a school, isn't it? Now, the next one, her family were happy that she wanted to become a nurse. Were her family happy? No, they definitely were not happy. So that one's false. And can you remember why they weren't happy? Yes, brilliant. It's because people thought at that time that rich girls had to stay at home to look after the house and the children rather than going out to work, maybe as a nurse or a teacher. Now, the next one, she was alive during the reign of Queen Victoria. So was she alive when Queen Victoria was on the throne? Yes, she was. She was alive in the Victorian times, which was from 1837, so the 19th century, all the way until 1901, so just into the 20th century. Okay, the next one, she trained to become a nurse in London. Was it in London that she trained? No, it wasn't, was it? Can you remember where it was? Yes, it was in Germany. She trained to become a nurse in Germany. She went to Germany in 1851. Well, how did you get on? Well done if you remembered all that. Don't worry if you haven't. You can always look back at the video from last week, and then when you feel more confident, you can come back to this retrieval quiz and have another go. That's fine. But let's move on to today's learning. So here we go. We've got a painting, and it says this painting shows some of the fighting of the Crimean War. So the Crimean War started in 1853, and it was between France, Turkey, Britain, and Crimea, which was owned by Russia at the time. Now, what can you see in this picture? Can you pause the video and have a good look at the picture? What can you see? Okay, Year 2. Were you able to spot some things in the picture? Wow. Many men lost their lives during the Crimean War. So many men died during the Crimean War fighting. And you can probably see that in the picture. And the army doctors were struggling to provide medical care to the wounded soldiers. Okay, do you know what wounded means? Shall we find out together? So wounded is an adjective because it's describing the soldiers, the wounded soldiers. And it's a synonym for injured. Okay, if you're injured, you're wounded. So I said that army doctors were struggling to provide medical care to wounded soldiers. Now, I wonder why they were struggling to provide medical care. Can you see how many wounded soldiers are in the picture? And there probably weren't that many doctors to look after that many wounded soldiers. Okay, brilliant. Now, Florence Nightingale, on the 13th of October 1854, read this newspaper article, okay, which was in the Times. We still have the Times newspaper today. And it was telling, the newspaper article told her all about the Crimean War. Now, how do you think she felt when she heard about these wounded soldiers? Think about it. She's a nurse. What do you think she felt? Yes, that's right. She wanted to help. Okay, so what do you think she did to help? Well, she didn't have to do anything because this man here, Sidney Herbert, who was the Secretary of State for War, so he was in charge of organising the war, so what happened when, he knew Florence Nightingale and he decided that Florence Nightingale was the type of person needed in Crimea to help care for the sick and wounded soldiers. So the injured soldiers, he thought that she'd be a good person to help the injured, the wounded soldiers. So Florence Nightingale, what do you think she said when he asked her? Yes, she agreed. She wanted to help, and she tried to convince a group of London nurses to travel with her to Crimea, and eventually she convinced them. So on the 21st of October 1854, Florence and 38 other nurses left London and travelled all the way to Turkey. Now, I wonder how they got to Turkey. Shall we find out? So here's a map that shows the route that Florence Nightingale and the other nurses took to get to the hospital in Scutari. Now, can you see where we live, the United Kingdom, in red, where the line starts? Yes, that's where we live, isn't it? So that's where Florence Nightingale started her journey. And after she left the United Kingdom, she travelled across the English Channel. Remember, we learned about the English Channel in geography. It's south of the United Kingdom, isn't it? So she travelled across there with the other nurses, and then they travelled through France. Can you see France on the map? It's the orange country with the line going through it, because that shows that they travelled through France. And then when they got to the edge of France to a place called Marseille, they then travelled from Marseille all the way to Constantinople, which is now Istanbul in Turkey, and then to Scutari. Can you see Turkey, the green country where the line ends? So that's where they ended their journey. Now, how do you think Florence and the other nurses would have travelled to Scutari? Well, they would have had to cross land, and they also would have had to cross water. So how might they have travelled? And what do you think the journey might have been like? It's quite a long way, isn't it? Okay, pause the video now and have a think. Well, yeah, too. The journey took them a whole 2 weeks. Okay, that's quite a long time, isn't it? And they travelled when they were in the water in a boat called Vectis. Okay, and the weather was very bad, so the waves were very strong. Okay, so it's probably quite a bumpy ride, not very nice to be on. And Florence Nightingale got quite seasick, and the conditions on the ship were terrible. Okay, there were cockroaches everywhere, and it was very uncomfortable. So I'm sure it wasn't a very nice journey. And then when they were on land, like when they were travelling through France, they went on horse and cart. So eventually, after the 2 weeks of travel with bad weather and terrible conditions, they arrived on the 3rd of November 1854 in Scutari in Turkey. And I wonder what they found when they arrived. Well, before we do that, I've just told you a lot of information, haven't I? So I thought it might be a good idea to try and organise that information and put it onto our timeline so we can see the chronological order in which it happened. So already on our timeline, we've got the dates that we organised last lesson. So Florence Nightingale was born in Italy, her family returned to England, she wanted to become a nurse. She then went to Germany to train as a nurse. She then returned from Germany and became a nurse in a hospital in London. So these events that we're going to add are going to be after the events we've already got on the timeline. So let's have a look at the events we've got. The 21st of October 1854, Florence and other nurses travelled to Scutari. 1853, the Crimean War started. 3rd of November 1854, they arrived in Scutari. And 13th of October 1854, Florence read about the Crimean War. Okay, so could you, if you've still got it, get out the timeline from last lesson and see if you could add these events to the timeline after the ones we've already got? Can you put them in chronological order, the order in which they happened? Pause the video now and have a go. Okay, Yeti, let's see how you got on. So we need to find the first event after Florence became a nurse at a hospital in London. What did you think? Well done if you have put 1853, the Crimean War started, because that's the next event that needs to go on our timeline. Now let's have a look what we've got left. So we've got the 3rd of November 1854, 13th of October 1854, and the 21st of October 1854. Which event do you think is next? Because they're all in the same year, aren't they? 1854, but which date comes first? Yes, that's right, brilliant. It's the 13th of October 1854, which was when Florence read about the Crimean War in the Times newspaper. Now what comes next? The 3rd of November or the 21st of October? Yes, that's right, the 21st of October 1854, which is when Florence and other nurses travelled to Scutari to help the wounded soldiers. And then that leaves the final event, which was the 3rd of November 1854, which was when they arrived after 2 long weeks in Scutari. Okay, now like I said before, I wonder what they found. Let's find out. So this is a picture of what Florence Nightingale and the other nurses found when they arrived at the hospital in Scutari. How do you think Florence Nightingale felt? Doesn't look like a very nice place, does it? Can you see on the floor there's lots of people? What else can you see in this picture? Can you pause the video now and have a think? What can you see in this picture? Okay, Yeti, so let's have a look together. Well, as I said, there are lots of people on the floor, and it's probably very dirty, isn't it? So that's what I thought. There were dirty conditions with lots of people on the floor, and there were lots of rats on the floor as well. So that wouldn't have made it a very clean place either, would it? And they were also in the same clothes that they were wearing when they were in the Crimean War. So their clothes hadn't been cleaned. Now that's not very clean either, is it? It's very dirty. So it's not a very nice place to be so far. Now, there are also too many people. There are a lot of people in a very small room in this picture, aren't there? And they look like they're all on top of each other, which wouldn't be very comfortable when you're wounded. When you're already wounded, you do not need to be in such a cramped space with lots of people. Also, they lack basic equipment. Can you see that there are only 2 beds in the whole room and most people on the floor, and no one looks like they've got a blanket? And also, they didn't have bandages to put on the wound, so they couldn't keep them clean, and they got more and more dirty, which meant that disease was spreading quickly between people, especially because they were so close together. And did you know that more people were suffering and dying from disease in the hospitals than they were from battle wounds and from being in the war? Don't you think that's crazy? Just because of the dirty conditions. And at the time, they didn't know how disease spread. So they just thought this was normal, and they didn't understand why lots of people were dying in the hospitals, because they didn't understand that the dirty conditions and the amount of people meant that the disease was spreading. Now they went to the toilet in what's called a chamber pot, okay, so a little pot that you go to the toilet in, and that same chamber pot was used by all of the men in this room. That's not very clean either, is it? And there was very little food, which isn't great when you're trying to get better. Food, keeps you healthy. And there weren't very many medical supplies. So there weren't the things that we have in the hospitals today to help them to get better. But despite all these bad conditions, all these dirty conditions, when Florence Nightingale arrived at this hospital in Scutari, the doctor said they didn't want their help. Why do you think that was? Well, they were professionals and they didn't know any different, and they thought they were doing the right thing for the people in these hospitals. So they turned Florence Nightingale down and the other nurses and said, we don't need your help.